Freezing wolf pups were crying at the threshold of the hut. The mother was searching for a last chance at salvation, but what happened next shocked everyone. What would make you open the door behind which death itself howls? The wind battered the log walls of the old hut like a massive invisible beast. It hurled handfuls of stinging snow at the single window, glazed with a crust of ice. Inside, on a wide bench under a pile of old sheepskin coats, Aelfina tossed in fever. Her breathing was ragged and intermittent. Beside her, huddled in a ball, sat 7-year-old Kostya. He wasn't crying. In the taiga, you learn not to cry early. He simply stared at the darkened ceiling beams and listened to two sounds: his mother's heavy breathing and the endless song of the blizzard. But suddenly, a third sound pierced through that howl. A thin, pitiful, almost human wail, and faint scratching at the door. Kostya froze. In the taiga, any unfamiliar sound at night is a signal of alarm. He carefully slid off the bench and tiptoed to his mother. "Mom!" he whispered, touching her hot forehead. "Someone's there." Aelfina struggled to open her eyelids. Her mind was foggy. The room swam before her eyes. "Who, son?" she croaked. "I don't know." Scratching and crying. A primal, sticky fear momentarily cleared Aelfina's mind. Who could be out there, 30 kilometers from the nearest village on a night like this? Wandering bears were hibernating. A lynx wouldn't scratch at the door. Wolves. The thought of wolves sent a chill down her spine, unrelated to her illness. She knew all too well what a wolf pack was like in winter. Her husband Andre, an experienced hunter, always said, "A hungry wolf knows neither fear nor pity." With superhuman effort, she rose, leaning against the wall. Each step echoed with pounding in her head. "Don't come near," she whispered to her son, who followed her. Reaching the door, she pressed her ear to the cold wood. The blizzard's howl quieted for a moment, and she heard it again. A quiet, desperate cry, not from one but several. It was filled not with threat, but suffering. Before we continue, let us know what city you're from. We're curious where our viewers are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It motivates us to make new and interesting videos. And now let's begin. Something about that sound wouldn't let her rest. It wasn't the growl of an adult predator. It was the cry of dying children. The illness blurred reality with delirium, but her maternal instinct, the oldest and most powerful, spoke louder than fear. She spotted a crack between the doorframe planks, stuffed with tow. Pulling out a tuft, she peered through the hole. What she saw in the gray, snowy whirlwind made her heart clench. On the snow-covered porch, huddled in a tight, shivering ball, lay 3 tiny wolf pups. Their fur was iced over. They were barely alive. They no longer howled, only whimpered faintly, instinctively pressing against each other for the last bit of warmth. Aelfina recoiled. This was madness. Wild animals, future killers. But right now, she saw only 3 freezing infants. Her fevered, inflamed mind drew a terrifying parallel. She, dying of illness inside the hut, and they, dying of cold outside. Her son Kostya, who would be left utterly alone if she didn't pull through. A sudden, irrational decision formed in her head. A decision any taiga dweller would call suicide. She turned to Kostya. His big eyes were full of horror and questions. "Kostya," she said firmly, surprised at the strength in her voice. "Slide the bolt back." The boy froze, not believing his ears. "Mom, they're wolves. They're small, they're dying. Slide it." There was steel in her voice that Kostya dared not disobey. Overcoming his trembling, he reached for the heavy oak latch. The door creaked open, letting in a whirlwind of icy air and snow. The pups, sensing the faint warmth, made one last desperate effort. One by one, they crawled over the threshold and collapsed on the floor by the cooling stove, forming a lifeless gray heap. And in that moment, as Kostya slammed the door shut, Aelfina glimpsed something else in the snowy haze at the forest's edge for a split second. 2 eyes burning with yellow fire. A gaze full of despair, hunger, and powerless rage. The mother, She was there. She had seen everything. By morning, the fever had broken. Elfina woke with a clear but heavy head. The first thing she saw was Kostya, squatting by the stove. He was offering the 3 gray bundles a bowl of melted snow. The pups, having warmed up overnight, stirred weakly. One even tried to lap at the water unsteadily. The realization of what she had done crashed over Elfina with deafening force. She had let 3 predators into her home, near her only child, and their mother was somewhere nearby. Outside, a long, mournful howl rang out. It wasn't like yesterday's, carried not just sorrow, but demand. The she-wolf circled the hut, not daring to approach but refusing to leave. Each cry made Elfina shudder. Food supplies were running out. The last crust of bread, some dried meat and grains. Firewood would last only a couple more days. She was trapped, ill with a child and 3 wolf pups in a besieged hut. She wanted to yell at Kostya, to make him stay away from the pups, but the words stuck in her throat. The boy, forgetting his fear, broke off a piece of his morning hardtack and held it to the muzzle of the weakest pup. It snorted uncertainly but then greedily sucked in the crumbs. In that moment, Elfina understood there was no turning back. She couldn't throw them out into the frost. Not after Kostya looked at her with such hope. She sighed, stood, and approached them. "They need to eat," Kostya said quietly, not taking his eyes off the pups. Elfina nodded silently. She took the last piece of dried elk meat, finally chopped it with a knife and placed it on a board. The scent of food revived the little bodies. They fussed, poking their noses into the meat, clumsily trying to snag their share. And outside the wall, the howl sounded again. But now, to Elfina, it seemed to hold not just threat, but something like a plea. Hundreds of kilometers to the north, pushing through deep snow on an old Baran snowmobile, rode 2 men. Fyodor Kuzmich, or simply Fyodoric, was at the wheel. His weathered face was utterly calm, as if he were part of this snow-covered landscape. Behind him in the sled sat Jaeger. He shivered from the cold now and then, though his imported snowsuit cost more than Fyodoric's entire snowmobile. "Well, Kuzmich, how much longer are we zigzagging?" Jaeger asked impatiently, shouting over the engine's roar. "The tracks are almost snowed over." Fyodoric didn't turn. "The trail, Yegorka, isn't just in the snow. It's in the air, in the beast's habits. Have patience." "Patience," Jaeger snorted. "In Sosnovka, they've already torn apart 3 calves. The chairman promised a reward, and here we are meditating." They were following a large wolf pack. This winter, the wolves had been unusually bold. Hunger drove them from the taiga's depths closer to human settlements. For Jaeger, this was a chance to earn money and prove to the old man he was worth something. For Fyodoric, it was the work he'd done all his life. But something troubled him. He'd seen the tracks. The pack was large but somehow fractured. Tracks of several adult wolves went one way, while a lone she-wolf's went another. That wasn't right. Not wolf-like. "Look!" Fyodoric shut off the engine. Silence crashed over them, ringing in their ears. He pointed at the snow. "Here she went alone. See how deep she sinks? Exhausted. And look!" He traced a gloved finger over barely visible droplets on the snow. "Blood. A little wounded or recently gave birth." Jaeger jumped from the sled. "Gave birth? That's even better. Means the den's nearby. We'll find the pups and that's that." Excitement rang in his voice. Fyodoric looked at him with mild disapproval. "A she-wolf with pups. That's the most dangerous beast in the taiga. More dangerous than a bear. She's not fighting for herself. Remember that." He restarted the snowmobile. The lone she-wolf's trail led them straight toward the abandoned homestead of Andrei Volkov, Alefina's husband. Fyodoric knew the place. He thought no one had lived there for years. 2 days passed. Life in the hut settled into a strange, tense routine. The pups grew a bit stronger. They even tried to play clumsily with each other, nipping at ears and tails. Kostya named them Gray, Blackie, and Reddish, for the faint reddish tint on one side. Elfina, whose illness was slowly receding, divided the remaining food into tiny portions for herself, her son, and the uninvited guests. The she-wolf no longer appeared under the windows, but her presence was felt constantly. Then something incredible happened. In the morning, peering out the window, Elfina saw a dark spot on the porch. It was a frozen white hair with a twisted neck. She froze, unsure what to think. A trap? A warning? She stared at the motionless carcass for a long time, battling the urge to take it. Hunger won over fear. Quickly opening the door, she grabbed the hair and brought it inside. Kostya watched her wide-eyed. "She brought it," he whispered. Elfina didn't answer. She didn't know. The next day, the story repeated. A capercaillie lay on the porch. Elfina began to understand. The she-wolf was too weak to hunt large game, but she had enough strength for small prey, and she brought it here, not for the people, but for her children. She heard their whimpers, smelled them, and desperately tried to feed them, not daring to approach the human dwelling. It wasn't a gift. It was a desperate gesture from a mother willing to do anything for her offspring. This silent, unspoken pact between two mothers, one human, one beast, was the strangest and most terrifying thing that had ever happened in Alefina's life. The snowmobile stalled for good 10 kilometers from the homestead. Out of gas. "Damn it!" Jaeger cursed, kicking a snowdrift hard. "I told you to take a canister." Fyodoric calmly dismounted. "Now on foot. Not far left." "Not far? In this snow? We won't make it by night." "We will," the old man replied shortly, slinging his old carbine and backpack over his shoulder. He looked at the tracks. The she-wolf's trail was fresh, very fresh, and it led straight to Volkov's homestead. Fyodoric frowned. Something was very wrong. He remembered Elfina, young Andrei's wife. After his death on a hunt, she had planned to move to the village. Could she have stayed to winter here alone with the child? That thought made him quicken his pace. Jaeger barely kept up, cursing the frost, the snow, and the stubborn old man. He no longer thought of pelts. He just wanted to be warm. After several hours of grueling travel, they emerged onto a small rise overlooking a snow-buried clearing. In the middle, nearly drowning in drifts, stood the hut. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was inside. Finally, Jaeger exhaled. "We'll go in, warm up, then deal with the she-wolf." But Fyodoric stopped him, finger to lips. He silently pointed to the forest edge near the hut. Jaeger squinted and saw her. A large gray she-wolf standing motionless among the trees, gazing at the hut. Her posture was tense, but without aggression. She just watched, waited. "There she is, the gray one," Jaeger whispered, slowly shouldering his new rifle with optic sight. "Like on a platter. One shot. Fyodoric. Wait!" The old man hissed, grabbing the barrel. "Don't rush. You don't see. She's not hunting. She's waiting." "Waiting for what? An invitation to dinner? Don't interfere, Fyodoric. She'll get away." At that very moment, the hut's heavy door creaked open. Elfina stepped onto the porch. She wore an old sheepskin coat, a scarf on her head, carrying an empty bucket. Seeing her, Jaeger froze, mouth agape. A woman here. Elfina took a few steps from the porch, heading to the well. Then she felt eyes on her. She slowly raised her head and looked toward the forest edge. Her gaze met the she-wolf's. They stared at each other for several long seconds. Two mothers, each protecting her own offspring. In that exchange, there was no fear or hatred, only a heavy, silent understanding. Elfina was the first to look away and continue to the well. The she-wolf didn't stir. Watching this silent scene through his optic sight, Jaeger understood nothing. What the hell was going on here? Why wasn't the wolf attacking? Why wasn't the woman afraid? He pressed his finger to the trigger again. It was the perfect moment. The woman was aside. The beast stood still. "Jaeger, I said don't you dare," Fyodoric whispered harshly. But excitement had fully gripped the young hunter. He saw only the target and the reward. He was about to pull the trigger when the door burst open. Kostya ran onto the porch. "Mom, look!" he shouted. and following him, unsteadily stepping paws on the snow, 3 little wolf pups emerged onto the porch. They saw their mother at the forest and whimpered pitifully. The she-wolf took a step forward but froze, spotting the hunters on the hill. And Kostya, seeing the pups scared, did something that completely shattered Jaeger's worldview. He hugged one of the pups, pressing it to his coat, and whispered, "Don't be afraid, I won't give you up." The scene froze for a few heartbeats, then exploded with a deafening sound. But it wasn't Jaeger's shot. It was Fyodorika's sharp, whip-like voice, "Drop it!" At the same time, the old hunter struck the rifle barrel upward from below. The shot went into the sky, tearing the frosty silence and echoing through the taiga. Startled birds took off from snow-laden firs. The she-wolf at the forest edge vanished instantly, dissolving into the thicket like a gray ghost. The pups on the porch huddled into a shivering ball and hid behind Kostya. Elfina instinctively shielded her son, grabbing a heavy axe from the woodpile. "Have you lost your mind, boy?" Fyodorik growled, yanking the rifle from Jaeger's weakened hands. "Shooting near a dwelling? You nearly hit the child." Jaeger stared at the scene by the hut with glazed eyes. He couldn't piece together what he saw. A woman with an axe, a boy hugging a wolf pup, and a wild beast they were essentially sheltering. "Fyodorik, did you see? They're with them. This is some witchcraft. Watch your tongue. Find out first." The old man cut him off. His face was stern and focused. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, showing he meant no force, and slowly descended the hill toward the hut. "And you stay here and cool off." Jaeger remained in place, staring bewildered after his partner. His head was spinning. He'd come to the taiga for prey, for a simple world of hunter and beast, but ended up in some nightmare. He watched Fyodorik approach the woman, and his finger instinctively rested on the cold trigger again. Fyodorik stopped 10 paces from the porch, palms open. "We come in peace, mistress. Don't fear." Elfina gripped the axe handle tighter. Her eyes, dark on her pale face, burned with feverish fire. "I saw where your buddy was aiming. One more step, and I'll split your skull." Her voice was quiet but hoarse from illness and strain. Kostya peeked from behind her, clutching the whimpering gray. "Name's Fyodor Kuzmich. We're from Sosnovka, following a wolf trail." He spoke calmly and evenly, as if explaining the obvious. "And the trail led us here. Didn't expect to find a living soul. Thought the homestead was abandoned." "It would be abandoned if not for you," Elfina snapped. She still hadn't lowered the axe. Fyodorik looked at her carefully, then at Kostya, then at the pups who were starting to peek boldly from behind the boy. His experienced eye noted everything. The woman's unnatural pallor, her trembling hands, how desperately yet doomed she protected this strange brood. "Your Andrei Volkov was a good hunter. I knew him." At the mention of her husband's name, Alefina's shoulders slumped slightly. "He was," she confirmed dully. "Listen, Mistress Elfina, right? We're not beasts. Lower that iron. We need to talk. What's going on here? Why are wolf pups in the house?" His voice held no threat, only genuine bewilderment. Elfina hesitated. She was alone against 2 armed men. But in this old, weathered hunter, she sensed none of the blind fury emanating from the young one. She slowly, with visible effort, lowered the axe. "They were freezing," she said simply, nodding at the porch. "Crying right at the door. What, was I supposed to watch them die?" Jaeger, unable to hold back, started descending too. He kept his rifle ready but no longer aimed. "Watch!" he shouted from afar. "These are the creatures tearing up our livestock. We need to crush them, not let them in the house. Do you even realize what you've done?" "I realized they were alive, and now they'd be dead," Elfina replied quietly but firmly, looking not at him, but at Fyodorik. The old hunter raised a hand, stopping Jaeger. "Quiet. Let the person speak." He turned back to Elfina. "You're ill." It wasn't a question, but a statement. He saw it in her breathing, the sweat on her temples despite the frost. Elfina nodded. Had a fever. It's easing. Been here alone with the boy a long time? Since fall. Fyodorek shook his head. The picture was clearing. A sick woman in delirium, alone with a child in the snowbound taiga, hears cries at the door, and her mother's heart couldn't bear it. It was wild, wrong, but humanly understandable. Into the hut, he decided. Not talking in the cold. You'll freeze the kid. Elfina looked at him distrustfully, then at Jaeger, who had approached and stood nearby, glaring hatefully at the pups. They're coming in with us, she said, nodding at the pups. Jaeger spat on the snow. Over my dead body, sharing a roof with that spawn. Then we'll talk here, Elfina retorted, reaching for the axe again. Enough! Fyodorek barked so sharply that even Jaeger flinched. No circus here. Jaeger, rifle over your shoulder. And you, mistress, lead us inside. We'll sort everyone out. His voice carried such commanding certainty that no one dared argue. Elfina paused a second, then nodded to Kostya. The boy, sniffling, gently nudged the pups toward the open door. They, glancing fearfully at the strangers, darted inside. The people followed. Inside, it was cold, smelling of smoke, herbs, and something wild, animal. A kerosene lamp on the table cast flickering light on the sparse furnishings. The pups huddled in the darkest corner under the bench and went quiet. Jaeger stayed by the threshold, looking around disdainfully, as if afraid to touch anything. Fyodorek went to the table, removed his heavy backpack, and set it on the floor. He pulled out a metal flask. Spirits with herbs. Drink. It'll knock down the fever and give strength. He handed the flask to Elfina. She took it distrustfully, sipped a little. The burning liquid scorched her throat, but warmth spread through her body. Thanks, she whispered. Kostya clung to her leg, not taking his frightened eyes off Jaeger. So, tell us, Fyodorek said, sitting on the bench. Everything in order. How did they end up here? And Elfina told them. About the illness, the blizzard's howl, the scratching at the door, how she saw them nearly lifeless on the porch, how Kostya shared his last bread with them. She spoke simply, without emotion, as if retelling someone else's story. Jaeger listened, his face growing darker. Some delirium, he muttered. Just delirium. And what about their mother? She's circling the hut now. She didn't tear us apart, Kostya replied quietly, speaking for the first time. Everyone turned to him. She brought us food, a hare and a bird. Silence hung in the hut. Jaeger looked at Fyodorek, expecting laughter. But the old hunter was utterly serious. He gazed at Kostya long and attentively. The boy's telling the truth. Kostya nodded seriously. He pointed to the corner where a sack held remnants of the hare's pelt and capercaillie feathers. Fyodorek rose slowly, approached, looked, then sat again. So that's how it is, he murmured to himself. That's how it is. Jaeger couldn't take it. What how it is? What's happening? Fyodorek, you believe these fairy tales? A wolf bringing food to people. Maybe she sings them lullabies at night too. She wasn't bringing it to us. She was bringing it to her children, Elfina explained. She just left it on the porch, and I took it. Our own food was almost gone. Exactly, Jaeger seized on that. These pups are from the same pack wreaking havoc in Sosnovka. Their mother is a killer, so they'll grow up killers. We have to destroy them, Fyodorek. It's our duty. He spoke heatedly, convincingly, almost fanatically. He'd finally found a logical, righteous explanation for all this madness. They were enemies, and enemies must be eliminated. You're wrong, Jaeger, Fyodorek countered calmly. He pulled a loaf of bread and a chunk of lard from his backpack and placed them on the table. The trail we followed was lone, a solitary she-wolf. The pack drove her out or the whole pack perished. I saw old signs of a fight a couple kilometers back. Blood on the snow, lots of blood. And not just wolf blood. Maybe they ran into a bear or another pack? He looked at Elfina. That's why she came to the dwelling. She had nowhere else to go. She's an outcast. And she was trying to save the last thing she had, her children. The old hunter's arguments were logical, based on facts, on the language of tracks he read better than any book. Jaeger frowned, unsure how to retort. He was used to seeing the world in black and white, but Fyodorek had shown him 100 shades of gray. "So what do you suggest?" he asked angrily. "Adopt them? Take them to the village?" "I suggest we eat first," Fyodorek said, slicing a generous slab of lard. "Then think. Morning is wiser than evening." He handed bread with lard to Kostya. The boy took it, broke off half, and approached the bench, extending a piece to Elfina. Then, hesitating, he looked at the hungry pups whimpering in the corner. Night fell, a heavy, oppressive night in the small hut that had become a refuge for sworn enemies. Jaeger slept by the door, rifle beside him, waking at every rustle. Elfina and Kostya lay on the bench, covered in coats. Fyodorek sat at the table, head propped on his hand, dozing. He'd taken the first watch. The pups, emboldened in the dark, emerged from under the bench and, finding an old sheepskin, huddled on it in a warm ball. The blizzard outside quieted. The dead, ringing silence that comes to the taiga only in bitter frost set in. And suddenly, that silence was shattered by a sound. It wasn't the lone she-wolf's howl, full of sorrow and despair. It was a low, guttural howl from the north, commanding and confident. Almost immediately, a second answered from the west, then a third from the east. The sounds grew closer. Fyodorek snapped awake from his doze. He went to the window and tried to peer into the darkness. Jaeger sat up on his bedroll, instinctively gripping his rifle. "What is that?" he whispered. Elfina woke too and pulled the frightened Kostya close. The pups in the corner whimpered, sensing something terrifying and familiar. Fyodorek turned. His face in the lamp's faint light was like a stone mask. "The pack," he said dully. "The other one that survived. They'd scented her and her pups." Outside, a new howl rang out, this time very close, and it held nothing but hungry, primal fury. They'd surrounded the hut, and they hadn't come for food. They'd come for their own, to destroy the outsider's offspring. In the hut, it grew so quiet you could hear the wick crackling in the kerosene lamp. Outside in the dark, shadows moved, dozens of shadows. A low, guttural growl sounded right under the window, then another from the other side. They weren't howling, they were growling. It was the sound of confident power, of predators who'd cornered their prey. Kostya sobbed, burying his face in his mother's side. Elfina hugged him as tightly as she could. Her eyes were fixed on the door. The heavy oak bolt now seemed like a thin splinter. The pups under the bench fell silent. Their whimpers turned to frightened, ragged breathing. They sensed death beyond the walls. "Fyodorek, we need to shoot," Jaeger hissed, jumping to his feet and rushing to the window. "Scare them off." "Quiet," the old man ordered. He didn't move, but his whole body tensed like a string. He listened. "Shooting now is like ringing a bell. They'll know we're here and that we're afraid. There are many, not enough bullets for all. So sit and wait for them to break down the door?" Jaeger's voice edged into hysteria, and then a new sound came, a sharp, scraping scratch on wood. Then another and another. They were testing the walls for weakness, seeking a vulnerable spot. This methodical, intelligent action was scarier than any howl. Elfina shuddered and looked at the old frame of the single window. The glass, thick with ice, held by a thread. "Kostya," she whispered, "go to the stove. Behind the stove. Quick." The boy, sobbing, obeyed and huddled in the darkest, warmest corner of the hut. Jaeger's gaze darted to the pups. His face twisted in a malicious realization. "They came for them," he shouted, pointing at the shivering gray balls. "It's all because of them. Throw them out, woman. Toss those pups to them, and they'll leave." Elfina jumped up, blocking the corner where the pups hid. In her hand was the axe again. "Just try," she hissed. Her eyes burned with the fury of a sick she-wolf. "He's right," Fyodorek said unexpectedly, rising. Elfina looked at him in horror. "Not really? Blood will only inflame them." The old man continued, staring straight at Jaeger. They'll devour the pups in a minute, and that will only convince them there's more food inside. Lots of food, scared and weak. Is that what you want, Jaeger? Open a diner for them. The young hunter stepped back, thrown off by this icy logic. He wanted a simple solution, but the old man complicated everything again. Outside, a dull thud sounded, then another. One of the wolves, apparently the largest, rammed the door with its shoulder. The bolt creaked plaintively. To the table, Fyodoric commanded. Quick, brace it against the door. The three of them, the old man, the young woman, and the guy, pushed the heavy oak table, propping it against the door. It was a weak, desperate measure, but it gave at least the illusion of protection. The wolves outside, sensing resistance, went berserk. The growling turned to vicious, furious barking. Dozens of paws scratched at the logs, turning the hut into a drum beaten from all sides. Suddenly, a crack. Not at the door, but at the window. A large wolf's muzzle with bared fangs appeared in the opening for a moment. The beast had knocked out a piece of the rotten frame and was now trying to squeeze through. Jaeger, closest, reacted instinctively. He raised his rifle and, without aiming, pulled the trigger. The deafening boom of the shot in the confined space hammered their ears. The wolf yelped and vanished. A dark stain spread on the snow under the window. For a second, everything outside went quiet. The silence was even scarier than the noise. Idiot, Fyodoric growled, pulling Jaeger from the window. Now they know for sure we're here, and that we wounded one of them. He quickly stuffed an old coat into the breach, blocking the gap. But it was too late. The lull ended. The silence exploded into a howl. But this wasn't just a howl. It was the pack's battle cry, a cry of vengeance. They no longer tested the walls. They began the assault. Dull thuds of bodies crashed against the door and walls from all sides. The hut shuddered to its foundation. It seemed the old logs would splinter any moment. Jaeger, deafened and terrified, reloaded his rifle with shaking hands. Too many, he muttered. Aelfina stood by the table, gripping its edge with white knuckles, praying. Not for herself, for her son. At the peak of this chaos, when the door seemed about to give, a new sound came. Not from the hut's walls, but from the forest. A long, desperate howl. But it held another note. Challenge. Fyodoric froze, listening. The mother, he whispered. It was her. The lone she-wolf. She'd returned. She'd heard what was happening. She couldn't abandon her children. She couldn't fight the whole pack. But she could do the only thing left. She was calling them to her. The howl repeated, this time farther from the hut. She was leading them away, distracting them, sacrificing herself. The attack on the hut weakened. Part of the pack, obeying instinct and the leader's command, turned and charged toward the new sound. Growls, barks, sounds of pursuit echoed. She's giving us a chance, Aelfina said dully. Her voice held shock and respect. She, the human, hid behind walls, while the wild beast out there in the dark fought alone for her children against the entire pack. Jaeger lowered his rifle. He stared toward the window, where this unseen tragedy unfolded, and for the first time, his face showed something besides excitement and anger, bewilderment, confusion. He'd always seen them as soulless creatures, killing machines. And now one of those creatures was committing an act not every human could manage. But the respite was short. Not the whole pack left. The most experienced and strong remained, and chief among them, the leader. It became clear when heavy footfalls sounded on the porch, followed by a monstrous blow to the door. The table slid back a few centimeters. The alpha, Fyodoric exhaled. The smartest. He understood her maneuver, and he won't back down. The blow repeated. The upper hinge groaned plaintively. Another blow and a crack sounded in the wood. The door held by a thread. Bullets, Fyodoric tossed to Jaeger shortly. How many? 4 in mine and 2 in your carbine. 6 bullets against at least a dozen wolves. The old hunter looked at Aelfina, at Kostya huddled behind the stove. His eyes held no fear, only grim resolve. He'd lived a long life. He knew the taiga, and he knew sometimes it demanded the ultimate price. He shouldered his old carbine, checked the bolt. "So be it," he said calmly, as if giving a routine order. "Jaeger, at the window, shoot only if sure. Elfina, hold the axe. If they break through, strike. Don't think, just strike." He approached the door. Outside, the Alpha growled again, followed by another crushing blow. This time, the door plank itself cracked. Sharp splinters flew inside. Fyodoric pressed his shoulder to the door, trying to hold it. He knew it was futile, just a delay of seconds. At that moment, Kostya, who'd been sitting behind the stove quietly sobbing, suddenly went silent. He looked at the pups, trembling and pressed together. Then at his mother with the axe, the strange men with rifles, the door about to splinter. And in his 7-year-old mind, a simple, clear thought formed. All this was happening because of them, because of the pups. If they weren't there, the wolves would leave. He didn't understand the nuances, didn't know the pack would still see the hut as prey. He saw only cause and effect. While the adults prepared for the final fight by the door, Kostya, small and unnoticed, slipped to the back wall. There was a tiny boarded-up window for ventilating the cellar, a hole only a child could crawl through in winter. His father had once shown him how one board came out easily. The boy's hands shook with fear, but he stubbornly pried at the frozen wood. He beckoned one of the pups, the smallest reddish, grabbed it by the scruff like their mother would, and before anyone could grasp his plan, Kostya shoved the squirming pup outside, into the snow and darkness, straight into the jaws of the pack surrounding the hut. The silence after the child's desperate act was shattered by the pup's thin, horror-filled yelp, then a short, furious growl and a dull, chomping sound. And silence again, dead, absolute, the kind that follows sudden death. In the hut, everyone froze, paralyzed by what happened. Elfina turned, her face a mask of horror. She saw the open hole and her son standing beside it, trembling, eyes empty and full of tears. "Kostya, what have you done?" It wasn't a scream, but a choked whisper. Jaeger lowered his rifle. Even he, who thirsted for these creatures' blood, was shocked by the cruel simplicity of the child's decision. Fyodoric stepped back from the door, his usually impassive face twisted in pain. He looked at the boy not with judgment, but boundless pity. The child had just made an adult's terrible sacrifice, trying to save them all. But he was wrong. He thought he'd sate their hunger, but he'd only ignited it. Outside, after a second's pause, the pack's fury erupted tenfold. The scent of fresh blood drove them mad. Now they knew for sure, easy prey inside. Helpless young. The blows to the door resumed with such frenzy that the logs seemed to crumble to dust. "All for nothing," Fyodoric said dully. "He only teased them." He leaned on the table again, but now it was just a gesture of despair. The two remaining pups, Gray and Blackie, scenting their brother's blood, huddled under the bench and whimpered so thinly and pitifully that Alefina's heart ached. She rushed to Kostya, scooped him up, pulled him from the dreadful hole. "Why, son? Why?" she whispered, rocking him like a baby. But Kostya didn't answer. He just stared at one point and trembled. He'd wanted to help, but made it worse. And that realization was scarier for him than the wolves at the door. "Axe!" Fyodoric shouted to Jaeger. "Strike at legs, at anything moving. Buy time." Jaeger, snapping from his stupor, rushed to the window, yanked out the coat from the hole, and thrust the barrel out. Gray shadows flashed in the dark. He fired blindly. A pained howl confirmed a hit, but two more took the wounded one's place. They leaped, trying to widen the opening. Their glowing eyes were close. Another shot, another howl. Bullets melted away, and then a deafening crack. The door gave, the upper hinge tore off, and the top edge caved in, forming a triangular gap. Through it thrust the massive head of the Alpha. The bared maw, dripping saliva, was a meter from Fyodoric's face. The old hunter didn't flinch. He'd waited for this. He couldn't shoot through the door without knowing the beast's position. But now the target was before him. He raised his carbine. The distance was minimal, impossible to miss. The shot thundered like a clap of thunder. The alpha jerked, wheezed, and went limp. Its heavy carcass jammed the door, preventing it from falling completely. For a moment, the attack choked again. The pack, losing its leader, fell into confusion. But Fyodorek knew it was temporary. The next strongest wolf would take its place. "Jaeger, last bullet," he shouted. "Got it?" Jaeger replied from the window, where he bashed at climbing wolves with the butt. "Shoot into the air through the roof." Jaeger didn't understand the order but obeyed. He aimed the rifle upward and fired. The last charge of shot pierced the leaky ceiling and burst into the night sky in a shower of sparks. "Now listen, both of you," Fyodorek spoke quickly, clipping each word. "They'll regroup and come again. We can't hold them. One chance." He looked at the glowing embers in the stove. "Elfina, all rags, anything that burns. Quick." Without questions, Elfina gathered old blankets, rags, pulled a sack of tow from under the bed. Fyodorek drew his knife from his belt and slashed his own coat, cutting long strips of sheepskin. Jaeger, kerosene, the lamp here. The old hunter's plan was mad and brilliant in its simplicity. If you can't beat the enemy with force, give it what it fears most: fire. They quickly soaked the rags and sheepskin in kerosene. The smell filled the hut. Outside, the wolves, recovering from losing the alpha, resumed the attack. They no longer rammed the door, blocked by their leader's body, but sought other ways, scratching walls, climbing the window. "Light it," Fyodorek commanded. He snatched a burning brand from the stove. Elfina and Jaeger did the same, and in moments, 3 improvised torches blazed in their hands. "Through the window, throw," Fyodorek shouted to Jaeger. He shoved a wolf's muzzle away with the butt and hurled the flaming sheepskin wad into the midst of the beasts. A terrified yelp rang out. The smell of singed fur hit their noses. "Elfina!" The hole where the boy was. Elfina rushed to the back wall and thrust her torch through the opening. From that side came frightened growls and howls at once. Fyodorek, prying open the top of the broken door, pushed his torch over the dead alpha's body. The wolves crowded on the porch recoiled in horror from the fire. They were predators, kings of the winter taiga, but before the red flower devouring the darkness, they were powerless. Instinct, older than their hunger and rage, screamed, "Run!" The pack retreated. Not immediately, reluctantly. They circled at a respectful distance, growling and snapping at the 3 tongues of flame bursting from the besieged hut, but dared not approach closer. The fire mesmerized and terrified them. Fyodorek, Elfina, and Jaeger stood at their posts like sentinels, occasionally tossing out new burning rags. The hut filled with acrid smoke. Breathing grew harder. Kostya coughed, huddled in his corner, but they were alive. They'd fought them off. Gradually, the wolves began to leave. One by one, they melted into the forest dark. The last to go was a large gray wolf, apparently the new alpha. He stopped at the forest edge, gave the hut a long, hateful stare, let out a drawn-out howl filled with threat and promise of return, and vanished. Silence reigned in the hut, a heavy, deafening silence laced with smells of smoke, kerosene, and death. Jaeger sank to the floor, breathing heavily. His hands shook. Elfina rushed to Kostya, pulled him from behind the stove, hugged him, kissed him, wiping soot from his tear-streaked face, and Fyodorek slowly approached the door and looked at the dead alpha's carcass. "Well, that's it," he said quietly. "For today, anyway." But everyone knew it wasn't the end. They were trapped, out of bullets, supplies dwindling, and somewhere out there, a hungry pack that now knew human cunning and the taste of blood. And they didn't know what happened to the other she-wolf, the pup's mother, who'd led part of the pack away. Was she alive or torn apart by her own kind? They spent the rest of the night in tense silence, listening to every rustle. But the wolves didn't return. With the first rays of dawn painting the snow-topped firs pink, Fyodorek made a decision. "We leave now while it's light." "Leave where?" Jaeger asked hoarsely. To the village, 30 kilometers through snow. We won't make it, and they're following our trail. Not the village, to old Yerify's winter cabin. 10 km south. Should be supplies and ammo there. Our only chance. He looked at Elfina. You and the boy coming? Elfina nodded. Staying was suicide. She quickly packed the remaining food in a sack, a flask of water, and bundled Kostya in everything warm they had. As they prepared to leave, Kostya suddenly approached the bench where the two terrified pups still hid. He stared at them silently. In his eyes were no more tears, only a heavy, unchildlike sorrow. Elfina wanted to say something, but Fyodorek stopped her with a gesture. What do we do with them? Jaeger asked quietly, nodding at the pups. Not drag them along. His voice lacked the old hatred, only weariness. Fyodorek looked at the pups, then at Kostya. Leaving them meant dooming them to death, either starvation or the pack returning to finish them. He sighed heavily. We'll have to take them. Jaeger wanted to object, but, meeting the old man's gaze, stayed silent. Fyodorek approached, carefully picked up one pup, and tucked it inside his coat. He handed the second to Jaeger. He grimaced but took it, the warm, trembling body pressed to his chest, and 4 people, taking 2 wolf pups, stepped out of the wrecked hut into the icy, silent dawn. They walked through dead quiet. The freezing air burned their lungs with each breath. The snow was deep and loose. Feet sank knee-deep, and every step demanded huge effort. Fyodorek went first, breaking trail with his massive body like an icebreaker. Behind him, step for step, came Elfina, leading the silent Kostya by the hand. Jaeger brought up the rear. Inside his coat, curled in a ball, trembled a little wolf pup. Jaeger felt its warmth through layers of clothing. It was a strange paradox. He, who hated wolves, carried the life source of his worst enemy against his chest. And that warmth was the only thing keeping him from freezing completely. He hated that warmth and feared losing it at the same time. Kostya hadn't said a word since leaving the hut. He walked mechanically, staring at his feet. Elfina felt his small hand in hers cold as ice. She knew it wasn't just the frost. Cold had settled in her son's soul. He carried a burden too heavy for a 7-year-old. The weight of a life he'd taken, trying to save others. After an hour, Fyodorek stopped and crouched. Everyone froze, afraid to breathe. But he wasn't looking around, down at the snow. Here, he called Jaeger. On the clean snow lay a chain of tracks. The trail was lone, solitary, and wrong. The wolf was clearly dragging a hind leg. Beside the tracks were tiny, almost invisible brown spots. Blood. This is her, Fyodorek said dully. The mother. Alive, then. Where's she going? Jaeger asked, surprised to find he cared. Nowhere, the old man replied. Just farther from the pack. Looking for a place to die. He rose or to survive. A beast has 2 paths. He looked south where they headed. The she-wolf's trail ran parallel to their course. She was somewhere nearby, alone, wounded, and as desperate as they. This thought brought no comfort. It only added tragedy to their hopeless situation. They pressed on. Now they weren't just crossing a snowy wasteland. They followed someone's agony. The sun rose higher but brought no warmth. It only made the snow blindingly white, hurting their eyes. Elfina began to lag. The illness, last night's strain, and the heavy trek drained her last strength. She stumbled and fell to her knees. Kostya stopped beside her. Mom, it's okay, son. Just rest a minute. Fyodorek turned. He saw the woman was at her limit. A bit more, and she'd lie in the snow and not rise. Break, 5 minutes. No more, he decided. Jaeger approached Elfina and extended a hand. Come on up, don't give in. She looked at him in surprise. His voice lacked the usual sharpness, only dull fatigue. She took his help and stood. At that moment, from the north, where they'd left the hut, a long howl carried. The pack, they hadn't left. They just waited and now followed their trail. The howl wasn't as distant as at night. Faster, Fyodorek said. He said nothing more. It was all clear. Now it was a race with death. They reached the bank of a frozen river. The ice, blanketed in thick snow, seemed a wide, even road, a chance to shortcut and save time, but also a trap. In the open, they were visible like on a palm. "We'll risk it," Fyodorek tossed, stepping onto the ice first. They'd crossed nearly to the middle when, on the opposite bank from behind dark firs, they appeared. One by one, silent gray shadows emerged onto the bank. At least a dozen. They stopped and silently watched the group of humans mid-river. Their stillness held more threat than any growl. Jaeger instinctively pressed a hand to his chest, protecting the pup. Fyodorek slowly shouldered his useless carbine. Elfina held the axe forward. This was the end. Nowhere to run. Nothing to fight with. The pack slowly, unhurriedly, descended onto the ice, fanning into a semicircle, cutting off escape. And then came what shocked everyone. From the same firs where the pack emerged appeared another figure. Gray, limping. She barely moved her legs. It was the mother she-wolf. Her side was torn. Dark, crusted blood showed on matted fur. But she walked. She saw her pups, one inside Fyodorek's coat, the other with Jaeger. She saw the pack preparing to attack, and she made her choice. Gathering her last strength, she growled. It was a hoarse, weak growl, but filled with such fury and despair that even the wolves froze for a moment. She lunged forward, straight at the pack. It wasn't an attack. It was self-sacrifice. She stood between them and the humans, between the killers and her children. The pack's new alpha, a huge black wolf, stepped toward her, bearing fangs. She didn't retreat. She stood, swaying from weakness, ready to sell her life as dearly as possible. This incredible, unnatural act, a wounded loner challenging an entire pack, stunned the predators. They were used to attacking the weak, not fighting mad ones. Fyodorek understood. This was their chance. A second's hesitation, gifted by the doomed beast. "Jaeger, the lamp!" he shouted. Jaeger pulled the kerosene lamp from his belt. Fuel was at the bottom. Fyodorek tore a clump of sheepskin from his coat, stuffed it into the lamp, shattering the glass. Flint! He struck several times. A spark fell on the kerosene-soaked wool. Bright, angry flame erupted. "Throw!" the old man cried. Jaeger swung and hurled the blazing projectile right into the pack center. Fire falling from the sky and the she-wolf's insane fury, ready to fight to her last breath, were too much for the pack. Instincts prevailed. The wolves scattered, tails tucked, and one by one fled back to the saving forest. In half a minute, only 4 humans, 2 wolf pups, and a dying she-wolf remained on the ice. She watched the pack leave. Then her gaze found her children. She whimpered quietly, took a step toward them, and collapsed in the snow. They reached the winter cabin at dusk. Fyodorek and Jaeger carried the she-wolf on improvised stretchers of branches. She was still alive, but her breathing grew rarer. In the small but sturdy hut, they laid her by the stove. The pups crawled to her, nuzzling her cold side, whimpering. She licked them one last time and went still. Fyodorek stoked the stove. Jaeger found a can of stew in the cabin and silently set it to heat. Elfina laid the sleeping Kostya on the bunk. No one spoke. Each understood they'd survived only thanks to the courage of a wild beast they'd considered an enemy just yesterday. 3 months passed. Spring came to the taiga reluctantly but surely. Elfina and Kostya lived in Sosnovka. Fyodorek helped them move, repair her parents' old house. Jaeger sold his expensive imported rifle and got a job in the forestry service. He no longer hunted. Kostya started speaking. He spent hours with the 2 grown pups living in the shed. One morning, Fyodorka's old UAZ pulled up to their house. "Time," he said simply. The 3 of them, the old man, the young forester, and the boy, drove the 2 young wolves deep into the taiga, to the reserve's border. They opened the cage. The pups, nearly adult, stepped out uncertainly, looking around. Kostya approached and hugged Gray around the neck one last time. "Go," he whispered. The beasts gave the humans a long, unreadable look, Then, as if obeying an ancient call, turned and silently dissolved into the green thicket. They had returned home. Who, in your opinion, acted more rightly? Kostia, who sacrificed one pup thinking it would save everyone, or Elfina, who from the start risked everything to save the stranger's young?